Welcome to the CNN Special Report, The Insiders, a warning from former Trump officials. I'm Jake Tapper in Washington. The world has never before witnessed so many former top U.S. government officials warning about the president for whom they once worked. It's just never happened before, not in these numbers and not with the same stark conclusion that President Trump, in their view, is unfit for the office he holds. The office he's asking you to return him to for a second term. It's a phenomenon that we cannot ignore. His former chief of staff, retired Marine General John Kelly, has told friends about President Trump, quote, "The depths of his dishonesty is just astounding to me. The dishonesty, the transactional nature of every relationship, though it's more pathetic than anything else. He is the most flawed person I have ever met in my life," unquote. Trump's former defense secretary, retired Marine General James Mattis, said earlier this year, quote, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us," unquote. This hour, you will hear from Trump administration insiders, some of whom have banded together to form the group Republican Voters Against Trump. These are people who know how President Trump makes decisions, to whom he listens, how he governs, from those inside the most exclusive meetings to those responsible for keeping our nation safe. Tonight we begin with the pandemic that has killed more than 200,000 Americans and two officials who were part of the early response from the Trump administration. Olivia Troy, a former member of the White House coronavirus task force, and Rick Bright, who was directly involved in trying to develop a coronavirus vaccine. Let's talk about the Trump administration and the pandemic. Rick, let me start with you. President Trump, frankly, seems only more defiant after contracting and surviving coronavirus. He's holding rallies with no masks required, no distancing, obviously. He's claiming he's immune, which is not borne out by science. Do you worry that his handling of the pandemic, which you've already criticized as reckless and careless, is only going to become more reckless and careless now that he's been infected?
I think it's beyond worry, Jake. I know that his actions, his words, and the things that he's doing now are extending the duration and magnitude of this pandemic. The people attending these rallies that are not following public health guidelines, not wearing masks and social distancing, they are spreading that virus. And unfortunately, in some cases, it is the older people, the senior citizens in the community, in Florida, for example, who are going to get infected from that virus from people from that rally, and they're the ones who are going to die. So his actions today are actually leading to more deaths from the pandemic.
And Olivia, you worked at the White House on the coronavirus task force. The president is directly putting the health and even lives of supporters and Americans at risk by holding these rallies all over the country. No masks, no distancing. Do you think he realizes that? Do you think he understands that he's putting their health at risk?
I don't know how he wouldn't realize that. I mean, he has been briefed on how contagious the virus is repeatedly. He's been told by the experts on the task force, you know, like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx and others who are every day have said this virus is very contagious and it spreads very easily. And it spreads especially in mass gatherings. So he is fully aware of this, and he still continues to behave this way.
Fauci told me that this is asking for trouble for the president to hold these rallies. President Trump, yet again, trying to attack, trying to undermine Dr. Fauci. You were in the White House on the coronavirus task force, and you saw the president sideline and attempt to discredit the nation's top infectious disease doctor. What did you see happen?
I did. You know, I saw Dr. Fauci brief repeatedly. He attended every task force meeting that I was in the entire tenure of the pandemic while I was still there. And I saw him at times, I saw people in the room during the meetings, people, senior White House officials, look away and roll their eyes while he was briefing sometimes. Or they would try to push back and say, well, can't you, spin the data this way? It seems that we're not looking at increasing cases. Isn't it true that cases are decreasing? Or isn't it true that children are completely immune? These are people who do not have any medical or scientific backgrounds. And I saw this happen again when he would speak out publicly. And I saw, them trying to manipulate the press briefings at the White House. I was complicit in that, Jake. I was the person that would have to call him at times when he was already on his way and say, Dr. Fauci, you're not needed today. I'm sorry.
Because they didn't want him at the White House delivering facts, delivering truth.
Correct. And they did this to other doctors as well. They did it to Dr. Redfield repeatedly. At times, they did it to Dr. Birx, where they said, you know, we don't want you briefing today because she had posted a slide or something that just didn't fit with the narrative that this pandemic was going away and it was not as severe as it truly was.
But the facts speak for themselves. The pandemic has not gone away. People are still dying. Infections are going up. This probably doesn't surprise you as somebody who was on the medical and scientific side of things. But what's your response when you hear about how Fauci was sidelined and undermined and not taken seriously by people who don't know anything about health?
Jake, there's no one in our country that's more experienced, has more knowledge, has more expertise about responding to an infectious disease or a pandemic than Dr. Fauci. And his expertise in guiding us through that pandemic is sorely needed. The rhetoric that we're hearing from the White House, the narrative that we continually hear that overrules and undermines the scientific guidance from the best scientists in the world, is actually frightening. Dr. Fauci, the experts at the CDC, the experts at the NIH and the FDA have the experience to pull our country through this pandemic. This White House, President Trump, has ignored that truth from day one. He still refuses to admit that we have a problem. And the first action to get through any challenge, any crisis, is to admit you have a problem. His rhetoric today still tells us he's in complete denial, and he forces everyone around him and in his inner circle to believe and buy in and repeat that narrative. That narrative is what's causing more deaths today. He needs to admit the truth, and he needs to be honest with Americans. He's not done that yet today.
And we should point out, you're a scientist. You're somebody that's been in public health for decades. You don't want to be here. You don't want to be talking about this. You would rather be in the administration trying to solve the problem of this pandemic.
It is what I studied to do. It's what I plan to do, what I prepared to do. It's what I exercised to do for many years, for decades, actually. I've worked with the WHO. I've worked with the Gates Foundation and different organizations. I've worked in government. I've worked in industry. We all know what needs to be done. It is so frustrating to encounter a White House that is resistant to those actions. You know, we have practiced and planned and exercised all of the things that we need to do to address a pandemic. However, the one thing that we never anticipated in decades of planning was resistance from the President of the United States, resistance from the White House, and refusal to admit there's a problem. We never anticipated that in any pandemic planning. That is why we're in the trouble we're in today, because this president still refuses to acknowledge there's a problem.
Yeah, you never war-gamed for the person playing the president to say, I don't believe it. Why? Why does he do this, Olivia? You've seen him in the White House. You've helped, you've been there when he asked Vice President Pence to take the lead of the coronavirus task force. I mean, there are projections now that we're going to lose up to 400,000 Americans by February. Does he even comprehend this? Why doesn't he care?
First, we've been talking about the fact that this virus would likely not go away. We knew, he was briefed back in the spring that this virus, it would probably get worse in the fall and in the winter, and that we needed to be using all of these months to prepare for that situation. And as much as he would hear these briefings, and I know he understood it, I mean, I've heard the Woodward tapes, which were quite frankly appalling to me because it was proof that he had listened and he was repeating what he was briefed about. But he is so focused on this political narrative of strength and the pandemic not being real because he thinks that it hurts him, and rightly so. This pandemic response has been a failure led by him. And I think he just does not allow himself to live in the reality that the rest of us are living in.
So in other words, he thinks that he can BS his way back into re-election, even though we all see the sickness and the death around us.
Well, see, that's the problem when he is the loudest voice in the room, because he has the platform of the Oval Office. He is the president. He has the biggest microphone or platform, so to speak. where what he says people are listening to and his words matter.